Yeah.
All right.
So once again, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to hear this presentation by Lee, Richter, and I am Tonya Lovejoy with Friends of Virgin Islands National Park, and this is a special Ocean Week seminar. And without further ado, Lee, I'm going to let you take it away.
All right. Well, sounds good. Well, thank you for having me here. It's great to see all these smiling faces. I'm here with you today to talk a little bit about some of the more kind of cryptic or hard to find fish that are here on St. John. Just a little bit about myself. Like Tony was saying, I work for the National Park Service. I'm a marine biologist there for their inventory and monitoring division. So part of that means we go do a whole bunch of coral surveys and fish surveys. But it's actually a regional kind of position. So while we do some of our surveys right here on St. John and Virgin Islands National Park, we'll go over to St. Croix to the national parks up there, and then also to a couple in South Florida to do some of our monitoring and research. So while I consider myself a little bit of a generalist as far as kind of working for like different corals and fishes and lobsters and seagrass, my real passion is for fish, and particularly tiny little fish that most people tend to discount and don't even notice or forget about. So I'm hoping to share some of that passion with you guys today, and maybe get you guys out there and snorkeling to check a few things out in the natural world in our oceans. So just from a little quick show of hands here, for those who have cameras up and stuff, how many of you guys have gone out snorkeling before? Yeah, all right, that's good. All right, bunch of hands coming up. That's great, cool. So this is good. Hopefully we can get you guys out even more and snorkeling in the water and to check out some more fish. So what this presentation is supposed to do today is that, like most times when you go out on the reef, we tend to notice like the colorful fish are the ones that are kind of ecologically or commercially important. So like that's the groupers or the parrotfish, the snappers, the big colorful ones. And while those are really important for us to have and really cool, there's a whole lot else that's there that doesn't meet the eye, just kind of at face value. So that's what I'm trying to kind of impress on everyone here, is that, hey, go check out some of these other habitats or some other areas that you might normally not go to. So in 2020, or last year, a couple of friends, some citizen scientists, and I started up a fish photo documenting project where we tried to essentially get a photo of as many fish species as we possibly could around St. John. And it's sort of an ongoing project, but we were able to, it took us to a bunch of different places that most people wouldn't normally go. And we found quite a few fish that we didn't know were here previously. So that was kind of fun. The big thing is, if we can get you out and explore St. John, find out what's there, that's a big plus towards conservation and making sure that our oceans last for future generations. Because if you don't know what's there, we don't exactly know what to conserve. So get out and go explore. So why am I passionate about tiny fish? Man, they are cool. I mean, this is just a couple of examples of what's out there. A lot of people tend to like not look in places where they don't see them. But if you start to look in those little cracks and crevices and dark places, you realize that these fish have an astounding variety of colors and patterns and behaviors. And I just find them absolutely fascinating. So hopefully I can share some of that with you today. So a couple of tips for you guys for who are kind of going to go down the fish scavenger hunt sort of train. And I realize this might not be applicable to everybody, but if you want to, kind of really embrace the fish nerd in you, there's a few things that can really help along the way. If you have access to an underwater camera, that is really, really helpful, because for particularly some of these smaller fish, it's hard to remember what some of their characteristics or patterns or colors might be when you see them. And they're oftentimes pretty small. But if you can get a photo of them, even if it's not a super great photo, that's fine. It allows you to compare it to an ID book once you get back in the classroom or your home or wherever you might be. Having an underwater light can also be helpful for some of these darker places. I think you can get them for pretty inexpensively somewhere, like online. I've got a link here. I'm happy to provide that to anybody who's interested, or any of these links for that matter. And then a couple of ID books. There's a couple that we that we use quite frequently for my job. One of them is the Human Reef Fish ID book. That's the photo that you see at the top right. They're on their 4th edition, and we kind of consider that like the fish Bible, so to speak. is that it's a really good reference. They've got some good photos in there and good descriptions on a lot of these fish. The Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute also has a website. They also have a cell phone app as well. That gets a little bit more technical, but they have a lot more photos to kind of choose from to see the variety of different color variations of some of these fish. The biggest thing though is a desire to explore. If you can get out there and start looking around, that's the most important thing. So one thing I noticed about that project that we did in, that we were doing in 2020 was it's not so much just about time in the water, but it's looking for specific places. Most snorkeling, most people tend to snorkel on the reef. And like I would say, they tend to notice like the colorful fish that are out there. But there's a lot of other fish species out there that tend to have rather specific habitat preferences. And if you're not looking for them, then if you're not looking in those habitats, then you're probably not going to find those fish species. So to make an analogy here, you're not going to go find a ribeye steak dinner by going to a Dunkin' Donuts, right? You know, you have to go find a steakhouse if that's what you're looking for. So same kind of thing with fish. And one thing I've also found is that sometimes it's even a smaller microhabitat. Some people think of a habitat as like reef or seagrass bed or sand, where some of these fish live in under a specific species of urchin. So if you're not looking under that urchin, you're not going to find that kind of fish. So with that being said, here's a few tips and tricks about some of the habitats that I've looked in and found some fun fish, and also about how to find some of these fish that are there. So one of the habitats that kind of surprised me in this project was actually silt. So by silt, I mean, this is like kind of almost muddy kind of stuff, really fine particle stuff, to where if you were to kind of grab a bunch of it with your hand and lift it up out of the water, it would stick together. And so the reason why that makes such a good habitat is because it sticks together like that. Fish can make these burrows inside of it, and those burrows will pull together in a way that like coarse sand sometimes won't. So these silty environments tend to be in protected bays that don't get a whole lot of wind. Oftentimes there's mangroves nearby because mangroves will break down that kind of wave action. One of the places that I like to go to when I'm looking for a silty environment is Princess Bay, kind of out on the east end. It's certainly not the only option that's out there. The south side of Haulover or Francis can have some siltier areas as well, but I find Princess to be pretty accessible and a good spot to start. So the first fish I want to introduce to you today is called the Orangespotted Goby. And it gets its name from a bunch of the tiny little orange spots that cover its body. The photo at the right is actually a juvenile. That one's only maybe a few centimeters long, but you can see a whole bunch of those little orange spots. And it's thrown up its dorsal fin. That's the kind of one on the top behind its head to kind of say, hey, look at me, I'm right here. The fun thing about these is, well, they tend to make these kind of deep burrows in the sand and will oftentimes perch at the top of them. And the fun thing about these fish is that they often cohabitate these burrows with a species of snapping shrimp. So that you can see at the photo at the left, there's the fish hanging inside the burrow, but right next to it, there's that shrimp. And so they live in what's called a symbiotic relationship, right? Where they kind of benefit each other. Oftentimes the Orange-spotted Goby will hang out on top of their burrow, kind of keeping its eye out for predators, while the shrimp will be kind of building the burrow and maintaining it and making sure that more sand doesn't fall in. If there's a predator or something scary, like a snorkeler coming by, oftentimes that fish will kind of alert the shrimp that, hey, there's something going, and then they'll both duck back into the burrow. A couple of other species of fish I wanted to tell you about, these are some of my favorites, are the Swordtail Jawfish and the Signal Goby. So these you'll tend to find in kind of these patches of silts that are kind of in and amongst seagrass beds. These two in particular are relatively common throughout, or not common, but you can find them with regularity, I should say, in Princess Bay, which is why I mentioned that one earlier. But the jawfish, which also, there's a few different species of jawfish that live around St. John. All of them have these burrows that they make into the ground that they hide in, and they'll kind of come out and kind of check things out. But if they're scared, they'll kind of go back down into their burrow. The Swordtail Jawfish is one of the more unusual ones. You don't find them too terribly often, but again, Princess Bay is a good spot to start. And they're a really beautiful fish. They have all those little markings, the bars down the length of their body. And another fun fact about the jawfishes in particular is that the male jawfish will actually incubate the eggs of a female jawfish in their mouth until those babies are born. So that's a really, really cool thing. If you're ever, if you're looking on the reef or in silt or wherever for jawfish, keep your eye out to see if you can find any that have a whole mouthful full of eggs. They're not eating them, they're incubating them until they hatch. Another fun one is the signal goby. So these two types of fish live in the same kind of environment, those silty patches and seagrass. And these signal gobies, they don't have too many colors on them, but the big thing is that kind of white bar that's right behind their gills. And that's really bright, as well as a few of the markings on their face when you get close. And these don't hide so much in their burrows all the time. They tend to kind of hover a little bit just above them, maybe just a few inches above the bottom. If they're scared, they'll go ahead and duck into them, but they'll tend to hang out in small groups right above them. And these ones, they're really easy to to glance over. They camouflage pretty well unless you're looking for them. So if you find one of these little silt patches, just hang out, kind of wait, and see if you can see one of these pop up, because they're probably there. Another fun one, one of my personal favorites, is the Yellowface Pikeblenny. So the Yellowface Pikeblenny gets its name, or at least the yellowface part, from the yellowface that the terminal males get. So the photo at the right is actually one of those terminal male fish. You can see that its nose is kind of that bright yellow. The other big thing that distinguishes the males is if you look on that big dorsal fin and it's throwing up, it's those two little markings right at the front. One of them is bright orange, and then there's like another black spot with a bright blue ring around it. And one of the interesting things about these guys, these do tend to be pretty wary fish. They'll hang out in their small little thin burrows most of the time. But one way to kind of get them out and to throw up that dorsal fin is to put a mirror next to their burrow. I try not to harass them too much, but the males tend to be pretty territorial and they don't recognize themselves in the mirror. So oftentimes if they see something that looks like another one, they'll kind of come out and be like, hey, this is my spot, what are you doing? And they'll throw up that dorsal fin to make themselves look big and say, hey, this is my place, get out of here. But it tends to make for a pretty good photo. The fish at the left is an immature female Pikeblenny, and it's one that lives, in this case, chose like a retired worm tube in order to go hang out in. It's about the right size for it, so that's where it was hanging out. So I'd like to move on to another habitat that's kind of fun, and this is the rocky shoreline or the intertidal. So this is that area that's kind of it's right at that interface between the ocean and the air. It also tends to be pretty wavy and really, really shallow. Sometimes it can be difficult to get to and also have a lot of wave action. So because of that, it's good to pick a nice calm day to go kind of check out these areas. Oftentimes there's quite a few urchins that are nearby, so you want to be careful that you don't become a pincushion. So places like that could be like Ram's Head, Klein Bay, Group Hand, Kittle Bay are good spots to start. But generally the rockier points tend to be out, or the rockier places tend to be out towards the points, not sort of in the base of the bays, but out around those points, you get a lot more of those rocks. The fish that you see at the right here is called a pearl blenny. These hang out in pretty much just the top 1 foot of the water. And they don't tend to hide very often, but they're still until you kind of wait for a little bit, and then they start moving around and come check you out. They've got these really big, thick lips and these kind of black bars that run through those lips. But keep your eyes out for those if you're in that rocky intertidal area. Another common one that's seen there, or another one that's common but not seen very frequently there is the Goldline blenny. If you start looking for them, you'll start to see them. And they get their name because of all the gold lines that run down the length of their body. These are also not terribly shy. They're kind of out, but they also tend to remain still, kind of perched on these rocks with just kind of keeping a lookout. But they tend to kind of flit around and kind of keep an eye on you, but also make sure you don't get too close, that kind of thing. I would argue that probably most of these fish that I'm presenting today tend to have that curious but wary kind of personality. Like most times, you know, if something big like a snorkeler comes in, the fish is like, whoa, that's big. That might be a predator. I'm going to go hide. But if you stay still for a few minutes, which might seem like a long time when you're just sitting there in the water, they'll realize that you're not really a threat, and then they will come check you out. So I would suggest when you're looking for all of these kind of fish, or even if you're not looking for anything in particular, but just hanging out in the ocean, stay still for a few minutes and see what comes out to check out you. One of the other fish species that I think is super, super cool is the clingfish. Now, this particular species, called the surge clingfish, actually spends a good amount of its time out of the water. That's right, you heard me, out of the water. It has a sucker on the underside of its body that allows it to stick to some of these rocks. And these specific clingfish tend to live in really kind of turbulent, wavy environments. And that sucker that's on the underside of their body allows them to live there. It's not really a great spot for other predators to come because it's super wavy, it's crazy, might get bashed into the rocks, whatever, but these guys are perfectly comfortable. You can see that they can camouflage really, really, really well with kind of their background. They look really similar to the kind of modeled background that they're hanging on to. But many times these ones are really common actually out on the east side of Ram's Head. And that's an area that gets a lot of waves a lot of the time. And when I first noticed that they were there, they're actually sticking on the rocks outside of the water. And it's the waves that come on that bring a little bit of that water onto them that allow them to breathe. So they're not necessarily underwater for most of their time, but they're getting some of the water that the waves splash up onto the rocks. So these next two species are kind of found in similar kind of areas along the rocky shoreline and areas where you find a lot of urchins. So the first I wanted to talk about is the Nineline Goby. It gets its name because it has 9 bright blue lines that run down its body. Now these guys are really, really small. These are maybe only a couple of centimeters in length tops. But that bright coloring that they have really makes them stick out. They also have a bright red eye. But they'll have a tendency to hang out underneath these rock boring urchins. Now, if you're not familiar with the name rock boring urchins, these are the ones that are about maybe a golf ball in size. They're kind of small and they're in those shallow areas right along those rocky shorelines. But if you see a lot of those urchins around, there's a good chance that you'll find some of these little fish hanging out under them. And kind of similarly are these guys, the Greenbanded Goby. Gets its name because it has green bands along its body. I know the folks who named these guys got real creative. But these ones have a tendency to hang out under the long-spined urchins. So these are the larger ones that have the long spines and are about a softball size or bigger. But these will hang out, or the Greenbanded Gobies will hang out under these urchins for protection. And it's a really smart kind of survival strategy, right? I mean, for these fish to hang out underneath these urchins, I mean, I wouldn't want to go after them, right? I mean, I wouldn't want to become a pincushion trying to find these guys or trying to eat these guys. But if, again, on a calm day, if you can kind of get close to them, they're really, really pretty in color, and they're fun to see. Okay, so the next kind of habitat I want to talk about are reef ledges and overhangs. So like I said, there's a lot of people when they go to the reef, they're kind of looking at the big picture, right? Swimming around saying like, oh, this is cool. But if you can kind of get underwater a little bit to some of those darker overhangs and cracks and crevices on the reef, there's a lot of fish species that hang out in there that a lot of people will have a tendency to miss. Part of that is because it's dark in there. It's dark, that's where some nocturnal species like cardinalfishes will tend to hang out. And it's where you can find some other cryptics as well. So having a light in particular can be really helpful when you're looking for these. These tend to be reefs with a whole lot of structure to them as well. So you can find them Kittle Bay, Cawvale Rock, Tektite, Pine Bay, Reef Bay, wherever there's a good bit of structure. So the fish at the right here, I have to admit, it's not particularly cryptic. These tend to be, they're fairly common around St. John, but I think they're one of the most beautiful, vibrantly colored fish that we have here, the fairy basslet. But they also tend to hang out near some of these ledges, or kind of on just like the outskirts of these kind of darker spaces on the reef. So there's a good chance if you see these kind of fairy basslets hanging out, you're near one of those ledges. And if you look under it, you might see some more of these cryptic species that hang out. So the first I want to talk about are actually 3 different species. They all are types of triple fins. Now, triple fins get their names because they actually have 3 dorsal fins. So we're going to take, well, I don't know, can you guys see my mouse at all? Whoops. Can you guys see my mouse on the screen at all? Can I get a couple of nods? Yeah, okay, yes. Cool.
Yes.
All right, thank you guys, appreciate it.
Yes.
So the 3 dorsal fins I'm talking about, these are the ones that are on the top of its back. So this is one dorsal fin, this is a second dorsal fin, and then the third one is right here. So it's sort of unusual for some of these fishes, but that's what identify these. And so these 3 are among some of the more common ones that you'll find here. The matador triple fin gets its name from the little red patch that's on its tail. Like the matadors out in Spain, they would have like a little red flag that they used to chase the bull. That's what gave them their name. And they also tend to have a more reddish body. The next, the roughhead triple fin, is probably the most common of the triple fins that we see here. And these don't have a ton of identifying characteristics over most of their body. The big thing is that they have a singular black patch on this little spot right before their tail. And if you guys want to know my favorite part of fish anatomy, this part on a fish is called the caudal peduncle. Yeah, the caudal peduncle. Try saying that 10 times fast. But these guys just have that singular black patch that's right there. And then the third one is the lofty triple fin. It gets its name from that first dorsal fin that tends to be higher than most of the other 3. And this one also has these dark bars that run down the length of its body. They're a lot more obvious than on the other kind of similar species. But these have a tendency to kind of perch on the sides of walls, around overhangs and stuff, just right on the surface. They're not particularly wary. They're kind of just sitting there, but they tend to remain pretty still. So a good way to find these guys is to run your hand kind of just above the surface of some of these rocks when you're trying to find them. And a lot of times what will happen is that you'll see one of them kind of dart away a few inches. And it's that motion that can kind of trigger you to look a little bit closer. The human eye is really, really good at picking up motion. The human eyes aren't great when it's dark out, but it's really, really good at picking up motion. So if you can bring a light and you can kind of just stay still and look for motion when you're looking in some of these spots, that's a really good cue to find some of these more cryptic ones. So moving on to the rusty goby. Now Tony was asking me at the start of this, he was like, hey, your fish is upside down. What's going on? And as it turns out, that was the one at the start I had on the title slide. So that was a rusty goby. But these species actually spend a good chunk of their lives upside down on the underside of ledges. Oftentimes they're on the ceilings of those ledges, hanging out, just kind of upside down, waiting for a meal to come by. So these guys have those orange bodies and then the white bars that run down the length of their body. They're typically just maybe a couple of centimeters long to maybe 6 or 7 centimeters long for the really big ones. So again, they're pretty small, but they're really cool whenever I find them. I used to think they were really rare, you know, wouldn't really see them all that often, but that was because I wasn't looking in the right spot. As soon as you start looking in the darker spots of the reef, particularly if you have a light, you start to see a lot more of these. And I realized that they're actually really quite common around St. John. So keep your eyes open if you're looking for these guys. Some similar ones, they look really, really, really close to the rusty goby, but they're not quite the same thing. These are really hard to find on the reef, but if they're one of my favorites, I think probably because they're so tricky to find, but once you do, they've got a lot of really pretty colors to them and fun patterns. So these tend to be even smaller than those rusty gobies, even though they look similar. The pigby goby, maybe tops can get to like 2 centimeters long. So they're really, really small. And they tend to have that kind of reddish body, but those bars that run down the length of its back aren't really solid. They're kind of more white dots that run down the length of its body. The dwarf goby has that orangish body, but on the back, kind of the back side of it, from its gills all the way back to its tail, it's more of a solid orange color. And the bars are really only toward its head. The third photo here, I realized actually just this morning that I'm not entirely sure whether it's the island goby or the mahogany goby. We had some DNA run on a similar species that we found here earlier on this year, and they're still kind of working out the visual cues to differentiate those two different species that are here, but it's one of those two. The little white bars on it tend to be a little bit more definitive, and it has a darker body. But again, these are all really small. You can find them by kind of moving your hand over the reef, looking for motion, but they are incredibly well camouflaged. I know with at least the pygmy goby, there was one time I was trying to take a photo of one, and it didn't have very many places to go. It was just in this tiny little barnacle hole, and I had the camera right on it, and then it just disappeared right before my very eyes, and could not find it again. So these guys are absolute experts at camouflage. So I'd like to move on to sponges. So remember what I was saying about microhabitats? These sponges are actually, individual sponges can make great habitats for some of these small fish because of all the little cracks and crevices and holes that they have in them. I find that barrel and tube sponges are a really good first place to start because those tend to be the bigger ones, and there's a lot of cracks and crevices that are in them. So one of my favorite ones here is the Shortstripe Goby. It gets its name from the little short yellow stripe that comes out from behind its eye. And these live in tube sponges that you find on the reef, and generally the kind of larger tube sponges that you'll find. Small fish, big sponge. But it's one of those things where if you're on the reef and you see one of these sponges hanging out, particularly if you have a light with you, go ahead and look inside one. There's a good chance that you might find one or two of these hanging out on the inside. I had no idea that they were there until I started looking on the inside of these sponges. And, you know, actually some of my more recent kind of scavenger hunts for some of these fish, I've been looking more specifically at other species of sponges to try and find some of the more obscure kind of fish that are out there. But these are actually quite common. They hang out inside those tube sponges, but just keep your eyes out for them. A next one is the sponge cardinalfish. So like I mentioned before, cardinalfishes, they tend to hang out in those dark recesses because they're nocturnal. So that means that they're out at night, they're active at night, and during the day, they tend to be pretty reclusive and hide from predators. So while most of the cardinalfishes will hang out in kind of dark spots on the reef, this particular species of cardinalfish chooses the dark spot inside of a sponge, and mostly these tube sponges, because that's a nice little tight spot where they can fit. So if you're looking inside tube sponges and you're like, oh, that's a larger fish than one of these little short-striped gobies, there's a good chance that it could be a sponge cardinalfish. And I will say these two photos that I'm showing you here are probably not typically what you'll see. Most of the times these guys will tend to be their face down inside the sponge. So you'll get a great view of a little fish butt sticking out of the sponge, but not necessarily its face. And admittedly, the one on the right, in order to get the full body photo of this for this project I was working on, I kind of had to coax the sponge out with it was actually a little chopstick. I don't suggest generally harassing fish or trying to get them out of their natural habitat. This was for a scientific project, but keep your eyes open if you're looking for sponges inside, or looking for these little fish inside of sponges. The next one is the barrel sponge, and the Tusked Goby in particular. So there's a lot of different fish species that'll hang out on barrel sponges. You'll find juvenile damselfishes, you'll find saddle blennies, a bunch of other really fun ones. But the Tusked Goby, it lives almost exclusively on these barrel sponge. They don't have a ton of really color to their body. They're mostly kind of this mottled brown color. But I like them because they live only really on these barrel sponges. And if you didn't know that, you would never, ever, ever see them on the reef. But now if you know how to look for them on a barrel sponge, you'll most likely be able to find them. Again, having a little light to light up those cracks and crevices really helps. So unfortunately, I don't have all of the time in the world. I wanted to make sure I leave some time open for questions here at the end. So I could go over a whole bunch of other habitats, but I wanted to kind of plant the seed for you guys for some other areas for you to check out. So the first is tide pools. So you can find some tide pools down towards Reef Bay. There's some that kind of collect in the rocks there along the side. And you'll find a fish species in there called the Antilles frillfin. Oh, I just realized I misspelled Antilles there. Sorry about that. But these guys live in just inches of water in those little shallow tide pools that you'll find. Not really something you can particularly snorkel in. You don't even need a snorkel to go see these guys, but if you can just look inside these tide pools, just with your naked eye, you might see some of these hanging out. They're really well camouflaged. So the best way to find these guys is to just wait for motion. So look inside a tide pool and you'll see something move. That'll be your cue kind of to look closer at that area. And you might just see one of these Antilles frill fins there. Another habitat is mangrove roots. Mangroves are a really excellent nursery for fish. They're really great for juvenile fish. So you can find a whole variety of different small fish that live inside mangrove roots. Sometimes you can even find like really small barracudas that are only like a couple of inches or a couple of centimeters long. I saw one that was just about this big on one of the little excursions. It's cool to see a fish that can grow up to like 6 feet long. Tiny little itty bitty. The next one is the cobble and rubble environments, like cobble beaches. You could think of the one that's out towards our past Salt Pond on the way out to Ram's Head. That's a good one. There's one in Klein Bay that's a cobble beach. And those tend to be really dynamic environments because the waves will move those cobbles back and forth kind of on rougher days. But if you go during when it's calm, you can find some fun stuff that hangs in and out throughout that cobble. There's a species of clingfish called the stippled clingfish that really likes those environments in particular. So, and again, I love clingfishes because I'm a nerd that way, and they're one of my favorite ones to see on the reef. So you can see those there. Sailfin blennies, which kind of like that Yellowface Pikeblenny that I mentioned earlier, have really big dorsal fins. So that's where the sailfin part of their name comes from. Those tend to be in kind of like the smaller rubble environments, kind of on the fringes of reefs. But you can find them kind of hanging out there inside their little hidey holes. And if you have an opportunity to go out in any one of these environments at night, I would highly recommend it. It might sound kind of scary going out in the ocean at night. Ooh, big scary things. That's really not all that scary. There's nothing too crazy that's going to bother you there. But the entire ocean everything behaves differently at night. All the nocturnal fish, the cardinalfishes come out. You'll find parrotfish that are encased in their like little mucus PJs that they live in at night for protection. Everything acts so differently, and it's a really fun experience to go out if you've never done it. I would highly recommend. Another interesting spot to look, mooring lines. So if you're out and you know either like the swim buoy mooring lines, or if you're in an area where there's a boat mooring, look out for boats. But there's a species of blenny, the American oyster blenny, that for whatever reason loves hanging out on mooring lines that you might be able to see. So that's kind of fun. Floating sargassum, that's all the weeds that kind of you float by and that you see floating by in the ocean. Well, they might kind of cluster up our beaches a little bit and kind of be kind of stinky. When they're out in the ocean, sometimes you can find a whole lot of juvenile pelagic fish, pelagic meaning kind of open ocean, deep water kind of stuff, using that for cover. The last thing, hurricane debris. I realize it's not a natural environment whatsoever, but there's a lot of fish and critters that like to use that for shelter when they're out there. It's not a natural thing. I'd prefer to not see hurricane debris out in our park or in our waters. But if you are looking for kind of cool, fun fish, you might find a few hanging out underneath a small little bit of tin roofing that might have settled in the sand. So if I can leave you with a couple of key tips for anything here, it's to go explore. The ocean is such a cool spot. I'm really fortunate that my job allows me to be in it a whole bunch of the time. It's a really fascinating place. And while my passion is a whole bunch of tiny little fish, there's a whole lot else that's out there as well. There's shrimps, there's nudibranchs, there's sponges, there's all sorts of stuff. And there's a lot that you can see that's really, really cool. No matter what you're looking for, I would say be patient. Fish or other critters for that matter are often curious. So if you wind up just sitting in one spot, even for a few minutes, I can almost guarantee you're going to wind up seeing several things that you would have missed prior to that. Another, and kind of in that same line, human eyes sense motion really, really well. So if you're still, it makes it easy for you to pick up something that's moving. If you're moving, it makes it harder to pick up something else that's moving. If you have an underwater light or a camera, those are really helpful when you're out there. I realize not everyone will have that kind of opportunity to get an underwater camera, but they can be really helpful if you're looking for this kind of stuff. And sometimes you might just see something that's really, truly extraordinary or rare that's out there. That was one of the top fish in the top right here is called a flabby sole. It lost the lottery when it got named that, but it's still a really cool little, it's kind of like a flounder, only it's about the size of a quarter. You can kind of tell if you look close at the photo, they actually have eyelashes. They're not actual hairs, but they have little bits that are right around their eyes. Looks like eyelashes. But again, like I said, you might see other critters, nudibranchs, shrimp, who knows what. There's a lot of really colorful and fun things that are out there to see. So with that being said, I see that there's a bunch of things in the chat. I haven't looked at that yet, so I'll kind of see if I can answer some questions here. But my email is right there. If anybody has any questions on fish identification, whatever resources, please feel free to reach out to me. I love answering questions and that kind of thing. I'd love to be a resource for all of you. And then I wanted to leave up kind of this stuff as far as the identification books or the websites in case you guys wanted to write it down or check it out. The last thing that I don't think I mentioned yet is Reef. It's a nonprofit that's out of Key Largo, Florida. They do a lot of citizen science and fish surveys, rely on citizens, just regular old folks like us going out and conducting fish surveys, and they've collected a massive amount of data because of that. But they're really good. They have several of these fissionars, kind of like this one, but they'll focus in on particular types of fish and really focus more in on like how to identify them, where to find them, that kind of thing. So I would highly recommend, if you got a kick out of this one, feel free to go ahead and check that out. Those are really helpful. So with all that, all right, I'm going to open up the chat window and see if I can answer some questions here.
Yeah, Lee, that was so great. Thank you. Oh,
my pleasure.
I would start at the top and work your way down. And for the class, the students that are here, do you have a time that your class ends? Got a couple more minutes?
We're technically about 7 minutes into lunch. Thank you so much, Lee. So I think I will, students who want to stick around and get their questions answered, I'll let them stick around. And those, you might see some leaving, and that's because they're going to go get their lunch. So
okay.
Thank you so much.
No, sure. Well,
I was going to say this is recorded, and so we'll just go through these questions. And thank you, Miss Laura. Thank you, everyone, and have a good lunch if you got to go get some food now. And yeah, I would start at the top and go for it, Lee. There's some great questions here.
Okay, cool. So I think the first one here by Jessica Guestwicki is there aren't dimensions on these photos. How big is a blenny? So while there can be a lot of variety in the size of blennies, most of them that you're going to find are probably around like 4 to maybe 8 centimeters long tops. There are some larger ones that you might find, but a lot of them are really pretty small. All right, so Nathan Like Fish has a question. It says, can a surge clingfish breathe out of the water? So I don't believe they can actually breathe out of the water. They can't breathe air. They have gills like other fish do. But instead of breathing the air, they're kind of using those pockets of water that collect up on the rocks or like little spots in there when a wave comes up to then breathe. All right, I see one from Lucy. It says, why do they need those blue strips? I don't entirely know what that's referring to. I'll tell you what, Lucy, if you don't mind, maybe asking what the blue strips are you're talking about. I can try and answer that a little bit later. All right, another one by Nathan Like Fish. What's behind the green-banded goby? All right, let me see if I can get back to that photo so I can answer that question.
Lee, I think the blue stripes was the 9-banded goby.
Oh, the Nineline Goby. Oh, okay. Gotcha. That makes sense. So why do they need those blue strips? You know, actually, as far as why do they need the blue strips, I don't know specifically for that fish why that particular fish evolved to have those little bright blue strips on them, or the bars on them. Sometimes fish have a tendency to have bright colors if they're, trying to, act brightly colored as a warning for predators to say, don't eat me, I'm dangerous. Nineline gobies, as far as I know, aren't dangerous. They're pretty small and would be a really excellent prey item. So, and also the bright blue bars don't look like they would really help them very much with camouflage. So that's a really good question. I hope to learn a little bit more about that myself. I don't know the answer to it. So what's behind the Greenbanded Goby? Oh, okay. All right. I see what you're looking at here. So yeah, so the one on the left that's the long spine urchin. That's what it's hanging out in the spines there. On the photo at the right, I believe that is a brittle star. So it's kind of like a starfish. They have really, really, really long arms, and they tend to, these are also nocturnal. So they tend to hang out in dark recesses of the reef and will come out at night. They're really photosensitive.
I was thinking of that. It looks like that, but it kind of doesn't.
Yeah. So they tend to hang out in those little dark areas, and they're photosensitive too, which means that they're reactive to light. So if they're in that dark spot and you were to shine a light on them, you'll awfully tend to see them move and try to get back in a darker spot. Yes. So I said, what did you call the things there back? Is that, hold on, let me see. Is that the dorsal fins? Is that what that's referring to? Is this a comment by Jada? I got the name right there.
Yeah, I'm guessing that's a dorsal fin. I've got it written down. I'll answer it for her. Thanks, Lee.
Okay, sure thing.
You also had that funny word that you said. It was your favorite part of the fish's anatomy, and then you said a funny word right when she typed that question.
Caudal peduncle.
Yeah, the caudal peduncle. Here, I'll type it out in the chat so you guys can see how it's spelled. But there you go. So it's, oh, come on. All right, I got to do to everyone in the meeting. There we go. So that's how caudal peduncle is spelled. C-A-U-D-A-L. And then peduncle is P-E-D-U-N-C-L-E. So it should be the last message there in the chat if you guys want to look back there to refer to it. But yeah, this is definitely the coolest part of a fish, I think. So I get a chat I got another one from Lucas. Everyone, where can you find this fish? Forgive me, I don't know what fish I had up at that time. Lucas, if you're still there, feel free to chime in.
It was the upside down one.
Oh, the upside down one. The upside down one. Yeah, so you can actually, you can find these in a kind of variety of habitats. You tend to find them most commonly on the reef under kind of darker spots and little ledges or little holes that are within those ledges. They're kind of, oftentimes you'll find like different kinds of sponges and stuff that will kind of grow over these rocks. So I've found that they tend to kind of hang out, encrusting sponges, not like the big barrel or tube sponges, but kind of flatter ones that have a lot of colors to them. So sometimes you'll see them in small little holes like that that are in those ledges or overhangs on the reef. Oh, friends, it's like you responded for me. That's good. So, and then Nathan, you had a question. When you get the DNA, do you have to kill the fish? So unfortunately, yes, you do. For at least the small ones anyway. If you are able to get sometimes like fin clippings from larger fish in order to get DNA. But for the smaller ones, in order to have enough mass to get the sample through, you have to collect them. We had a permit actually through the park to collect a few specimens of some of these fish species in order to kind of confirm the DNA on it earlier this year. So we want to make sure we don't take too many of them. We want to make sure that, that they're there, they can live on, but to kind of help figure out what exactly is there, sometimes you have to take a few of the samples. So from friends of the Virgin Islands National Park, have you ever found a fish that is not in a book? So I haven't yet, although among kind of the fish nerds of the world, there's what's called a unicorn fish award, which I wound up getting earlier this year. I was really excited about it, which means that it's the first live underwater photo of a species. So there's quite a few fish nerds in this world with cameras. So there's a lot of these that have been photo documented. But there was one over actually in St. Croix called the Slaty Goby that I took a photo of earlier this year. That was the first live underwater photo. So I was really excited about that. That was kind of cool. That was a big one. And actually, oddly enough, there's a type of clingfish that I think I might have found just the other day on a swim that I'm hoping to kind of go back and look for. I didn't have my camera, so I'm hoping to go back and see if I can find it again to get a photo, because I don't think there's a live photo of that one either. So we'll see if I can find it. I'll certainly let you guys know if I do. Another one from Jessica Guest Wiki: are nocturnal fish spooked by the flashlight? So yes, they often are. So the nocturnal fish, kind of like that brittle star, tend to be photosensitive. One fun fact, or at least the kind of on the photography side of things, I've learned a lot about photography, particularly underwater and fish photography over the last few years too, is that when you're trying to photograph nocturnal fish, a lot of times what you can use is a red light. A lot of fish can't actually see that red wavelength of light, although people can. So you can light them up with that, and that allows you to get enough light on it to get a photo in there. So a lot of times if I'm going out at night, trying to find some of these nocturnal fish, or if I'm looking in those dark crevices, trying to find a photo of one of these nocturnal fish that's hidden in there, I'll bring a red light with me so that I can get a photo of. And from Jennifer Stone, who's actually my neighbor. She's upstairs right now. Hi, Jen. So besides lionfish and sea urchins, hi there.
I'm not upstairs though.
Oh, you're not upstairs. Oh, okay.
Nope.
Well, the question is, besides lionfish and sea urchins, what other fish do you see frequently that we should avoid? You know, so to be honest with you, I don't know if there's actually a fish out there that I avoid. I have a tendency to swim to all fish. I know as someone who spends a lot of time in the water, I get a lot of questions about sharks. They're like, why aren't you scared of sharks? What are you doing out there? And the truth of the matter is, no, and it's not because I'm super brave or anything like that. It's just that really they don't pose much of a threat to humans. And I've learned over the years that shark behavior, kind of watching shark behavior is really important. So you might hear about like surfers or something that got eaten or that got bit by a great white or something like that out in California or Australia. Well, from the shark's perspective, a surfer might look like an injured seal. That's swimming a whole lot slower than a seal would be. And so the shark goes up, bites it, and is like, whoa, that's not a seal. What did I just take a bite of? So a lot of the times these shark attacks that you hear are called, they're great whites in areas where there are seals. And they're kind of a mistake by the shark, and they realize pretty quickly that they made a mistake. Unfortunately, in those situations which are really, really, really rare to begin with, someone can get hurt. But we don't really have great whites here. I mean, you might find one or two that come by very, very rarely way offshore, but in the places that you're going to be snorkeling, you really aren't going to see them. The common sharks that we'll see close to shore will be nurse sharks. They tend to hang out in the bottom. There's lemon sharks that you might see, reef sharks, black nose sharks, and I think of other common ones. I've heard a few people say they've seen a hammerhead around here, and all of them, you have absolutely nothing to worry about. The sharks are more often than not probably more scared of you. The only time where I might be a little bit more cautious, I know with CORE, the group that can go out and cull lionfish and is doing a lot to treat a lot of the coral disease that's here. If you wind up spearing lionfish to try and remove the invasive fish from the waters, sometimes that can attract the attention of sharks because the shark wants an easy meal. You have an injured fish right there, and there you go. So in some places, sharks have kind of associated spear fishermen or those who might be removing lionfish with an easy meal for the fish. They're not going after you, they're going after the fish itself. So in those situations, I might be a little bit more wary. But if you're just out there snorkeling, taking pictures, whatever, you have absolutely zero to worry about. And that brings me to the next question. Lucy, are lionfish frequently seen on St. John? So lionfish, yes, you can find them in places on St. John for sure. I feel like I've been seeing less of them closer to shore over the years. I don't actually have the science or the data to back that up, just kind of anecdotally off the top of my head. That being said, we were doing some deeper water surveys earlier this year, kind of off the south side. And we were seeing quite a few of them out deeper. So they are certainly here. There's quite a few of them. I think Core's done a very good job of training folks up in order to remove them safely, because they are indeed invasive. But I think their numbers are at least close to shore have been pretty well controlled, from what I can tell. From Wyatt, I have a question. How small is a barracuda egg? So I gotta be honest with you, I don't know entirely how small it is. I haven't worked a whole lot with barracuda eggs, to be honest with you. I would have to look it up myself, but I'd be happy to look into that a little bit further and get back to you. I imagine it's pretty tiny though, all the same.
Yeah, because you said you saw a barracuda that was just a couple of centimeters as a juvenile fish in Hurricane Hole, but then they can be up to 6 feet.
Yeah, they can get, they can get real big. But the juvenile barracudas, they really like to hang out inside, like in those mangrove roots. So if you're kind of snorkeling through the mangrove roots, keep your eyes out, because oftentimes you'll see really tiny ones that are hanging out there.
Their eggs must be pretty tiny then.
They must be. Okay, that's the same with turtles. I saw a giant barracuda at Hallover. Cool, that's awesome. They're fun to see. And then black tips.
And very scary.
They can be really scary. They look like they got the big teeth hanging out, and everything. Again, they really don't. Barracudas don't really pose a threat to you in the water. They're really not interested in you. The only thing there is sometimes they could be attracted to shiny things. So if you're wearing jewelry or something like that, and plan to be around like barracudas, might be worth taking those off, just because you might get a little kind of more curious attention from them. There have been very, very, very rare accounts of a barracuda actually like biting somebody based on that kind of shiny little bit of jewelry, but that I think really uncommon. I don't think you really need to worry about that. And then I hear the black tips at Reef Bay. Nathan, were you referring to the juvenile sharks that hang out there?
I think so, but I've seen black tips there.
Yeah. So actually, I'm glad you mentioned that too. When you're looking for fish, if it helps you guys explore a little bit, there's a couple places around St. John which are really good nursery habitats for juvenile sharks. In particular, like juvenile blacktip sharks and juvenile lemons. I think I probably see small lemon sharks more frequently than I do the blacktips. But Reef Bay is one of those places where you can see them quite a bit. And they'll oftentimes cruise by in those seagrass flats in about a foot or two of water. Another one is over towards Annenberg. Like if you kind of head down to or kind of more inside the bay there in that shallow, like kind of 1 to 2 feet of water where it's seagrassy, you'll sometimes see those little baby sharks that are maybe only like a foot and a half long, just cruising through the shallows. All right, scrolling right on down. All right, is that all the questions? Did anybody else have a question that they did not get to have answered? You guys are asking some really good questions. It makes me happy that you guys are so excited about it. That's great.
Laura, did you have any more questions from your students?
I think we are good, but thank you so much. That was really awesome to engage a group of 4th graders like that for that long into their lunch. Is a job well done, Lee. You can pat yourself on the back.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm just happy that there are going to be that many more little explorers here on the island. That's great.
Well, Lee, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you for joining us. And again, we're just really grateful for all the work that you're doing with our national park. And we'll have more presentations like this featuring our special national park rangers and scientists like Lee. So keep up the good work, everyone. Happy Friday.
All right. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks again for joining me.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Mr. Lee.
You're welcome.
I don't even know.